Hello, and welcome to Intersectionality in the Edit Room. We're just going to take another minute here to let more people come in and settle in. So thank you for being here. Hello, my name is Julie Vitsa. My pronouns are they, them. I am in Los Angeles, the occupied lands of Tongva and Chumash. People have been stewards of this land for generations. I'm a white, non-binary person with brown, short, spiky hair and some homemade fades with a pandemic haircut. I'm wearing a light gray sweatshirt with a hoodie, some long white strings. I am in my dining room, which has a gray wall, a plant, and some family photos behind me. And hopefully my dog will not bark during our session. I wanted to also let you know that this session is being recorded. And I'm going to next introduce our panelists. So please welcome Faisal. Oh, I'm going to introduce Faisal, Steph, Stephen, Luna, and Randy. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves. Given time, we're not going to actually put their bios on here, but they will come up in your chat, and we highly encourage you to take some time to read about these fabulous people and get to know them a little bit more. Faisal, will you please begin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Faisal Azam. My pronouns are he, him. I'm located in Brooklyn, New York, on the occupied land of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie people, land occupied since about 1630. I'm a South Asian male with short brown hair, brown eyes. I have a dark beard, which is what most people notice immediately. I'm wearing over-the-ear headphones and a light green colored button-down shirt. Some people call the shade seafoam green, I believe. And even though you can't see below the shirt, I assure you that I'm indeed wearing pants. Now, I can't speak for my colleagues. Finally, the room I'm in is my office and edit suite, and has numerous framed posters visible on the wall behind me, along with rust-colored curtains.
Thank you, Faisal. Steph.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Steph Ching. My pronouns are she, her. I'm speaking to you from the borderlands between the Nipmuc and Pawtucket people in Massachusetts. I am an East Asian woman, proud daughter of Hong Kong immigrants, with straight black hair, turquoise glasses. I am wearing a floral shirt. And I'm speaking also from a dining room in front of a coral colored wall and some Chinese watercolor paintings.
Thank you, Steph. Stephen.
Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be here with you all. My name is Stephen Golliday. My pronouns are he, him. I am located in Orono, Maine, which is the homeland of the Penobscot Nation and other Wabanaki tribal nations, where there are ongoing issues of encroachment, territorial rights, water rights. This is a new place for me, so I'm learning more about it every day. I am an African-American man. I have brown skin, glasses, a goatee. I'm wearing a white button-down shirt with triangle patterns, and I'm in my father-in-law's office and my edit suite for the time being, and I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Luna.
Hi, thank you first of all for having me here. My name is Luna X Moya, and I am in Piscataway, stolen land. My pronouns are she and they. And I'm Chronic Good Ill, filmmaker, and I'm wearing a brown dress with this beautiful embroidered black necklace for you all. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Luna. Randy.
Hi there, I'm Randy Redroad, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm speaking to you from Tongva Land near Alamitos Bay in Long Beach, and I'm a indigenous person. I've got a black shirt on, I've got a eruption of wavy dark hair getting grayer as I speak. Blue-green glasses, and in the background there's a bunch of paddle boards and jiu-jitsu gis and my children's toys. And it's actually my garage. It's now my office, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much, Randy. And thank you, everybody. I'm super excited to be having this conversation with everyone. We've been in conversation over the past couple months, and it's been really incredible. So I'm looking forward to our chat today. So this is Intersectionality in the Edit Room. We're going to do a few things. We're going to show some clips, and we're going to have conversations afterwards. And we'll show a clip per person, but then hopefully everybody will kind of join in conversation, and we're going to go through as much as we can with some of the topics that we've been discussing over the past few months, which has been really generative and exciting. In today's conversation, we're going to look at ways our intersecting identities can influence the filmmaking practice and can deepen a story, how a story is told, particularly from the point of view of the editorial team. And I like to look at it as a team. We like to look at it as a team of both how you look at it collectively of editors, assistant editors, all of the people who make up the editorial components. And our panel is going to share their experiences in the edit room as it relates to issues of representation. They'll each be sharing clips they've worked on to illustrate how these issues show up on screen, and then also in the edit room. I'm just going to briefly talk from an experience that I had recently on a film limited series called And She Could Be Next, which was directed by Marjan Safania and Grace Lee, who I just want to thank, and it was an honor to work on the film with them. Not only was the film incredible to work on, but the team, the experience of being on that team, the collaboration, the influence, the sort of generative conversations we had, not only amongst ourselves, but how we also incorporated our field producers, people outside of the edit room, advisors, community. It was really a very integrative process. And for me, that was one way of looking at how our identities really influenced the storytelling and the making of this series. It followed, so And She Could Be Next followed a series of 6 women who ran for political office in 2018 and the grassroots organizations that helped support their campaigns. And it really did take a deep dive look into what does representative democracy really look like. And I think that was reflected in the work that we did and how we did it. Grace and Marge also really made a lot of effort that everybody who was on the production side of the team, so all of the field producers down to the sound people, everyone, they really made an effort to try and create an inclusive environment so that the people who maybe they weren't from the region they were working in, but they definitely had a relationship to the community who they were in connection with. And that also came down into the edit room. I was the only white person in a primary role in that position. But it really was about a conversation of how do we include not only the perspectives of the people whose community we were involved with, but what does it look like in relationship to the rest of the world and environments that these people were living in. And so I learned a lot. It was really a very inclusive and interactive environment to be in. Including all the way down to my assistants. I mean, I was very involved with having my assistants participate. I mean, my assistant, Ileana Garcia, was instrumental in helping with storytelling and giving feedback. She also helped figure out one of the changes that we needed to make in the opening of episode 2 that I really feel like a lot of it hinged on. So I think that participation in the edit room and in the storytelling and how do we bring everyone into that process really influenced how we told that story. So given that as sort of a general framework, I want to dive into our panelists and their stories and their experiences. We're going to start with Without Shepherds. So can we roll that clip?
नहीं शाम नहीं आता है घर में, इधर नहीं, गाड़ी में नहीं, कभी किस तरह
कभी लड़की आ जाती है, ऐसा लड़की उस दिन मैंने ख्वाब में देखा, मैं सदके जावा, मोहब्बत की चीज है।
अभी तो खुद अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह शादी किया हुआ है दोनों ने, हम दोनों भाई है और हम दोनों का बीवियाँ जो है ना बहन है।
हमारे बच्चों से आप मिलेंगे, वो अजीब अजीब बातें करते हैं, अजीब हंसते, कोई शर्माता है, कोई हंसता है, क्या है, तरबियत नहीं दिया, माँ कब तक देगा। ये हमारा छोटा सा घर है, एक तरह का समझो कि पूरा पाकिस्तान इससे चलता है, वज़ीर आज़म से लेकर सदर तक, सदर से लेकर चपरासी तक, चपरासी से लेकर फौजी तक। एक दिन के लिए ट्रैफिक जाम हो जाता है, हड़ताल हो जाता है, सबका मुंह ऐसा खुला होता है कि गाड़ियां किधर गायब हो गई। ड्राइवर है तो सीट में बैठा हुआ इज्जत है, नीचे उतर या कोई इज्जत नहीं।
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that. Really beautiful. And Faisal, so we're going to start with you. I think one of the reasons I wanted to start with And She Could Be Next was to talk about sort of the bigger picture of being both in community, how that film really talked about being both in community and having people outside of community be a part of that storytelling process. Faisal, for you, you are part of the community that the story was being made from, but your director was not. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about your experience of coming onto that project and what it was like working with, you also had a co-editor on that team too, and what that whole sort of team looked like and how it worked to be able to tell an authentic story that you felt could be told.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a big question. So I'll try to unpack it a little bit in stages. So the director, who's white from New York, Carey McClelland, he, after 9/11, decided that he wanted to make a film on a part of the world that Americans didn't know a lot about. So he, did this amazing, really ambitious project where he went to Pakistan for a couple of years, worked with the Pakistani filmmakers on the ground, and in collaboration with them, they shot the film. It's largely shot by Pakistani filmmakers. I think Carey might be the only American who's there. Maybe there was one other. So they did that for a couple of years and came back with 800 hours of footage, following 6 people from different classes, all the way from an opposition politician who was struggling at that time, who's today the Prime Minister of Pakistan, a female supermodel, a woman who works in the tribal territories, the Taliban sort of influenced region in north of Pakistan, a Sufi rock musician, an ex-jihadi fighter, and the last person is the truck driver that you all saw, who is on this journey across Pakistan and essentially represents 80% of the people of the country, since it's an extremely unequal society. You've got a very small middle class, you've got a huge working class, poor, and a small, extremely rich, like 1% type level. So he turned out to be one of my favorite characters because he represents really what a majority of people are like. The film, I think, on production, they did a great job being inclusive, obviously, but when they came back, it was almost like a little bit of an afterthought because I sort of came to the project completely accidentally. I had worked with the producers, and one day, one of them was, just kind of offhandedly was like, hey, we're thinking about producing this documentary about Pakistan. would you be interested in interviewing? And they had no idea it was from Pakistan. It was like totally random. Right? And, I turned to them and said, you realize I'm from Pakistan originally, born in Karachi. And so that's how I came to interview for the job. And, I had to really push to get onto the project. It wasn't like, oh, you're from Pakistan, we're really interested. It was a challenge even getting on. And then I was supposed to come on as an editor, but instead they hired me as an assistant editor in the beginning. And, so we had to work through all of this stuff. And finally, having gone through a few battles and realizing really quickly that 800 hours were not going to be cut by one person, I was made a full editor. And for 2 years, the film took 3 years to edit, and my co-editor, Connor Callista, and I worked on it for the first 2 years. And so, together we basically worked on taking that material and whittling it down to, I think it was like a 3-hour rough cut that we had. So in terms of people from the community who had creative input on the film, I was the only one of Pakistani origin. We had an assistant editor who's from Pakistan, but she was a musician and she wasn't really an assistant editor. We sort of had to train her. And she was also being sponsored by the director with her citizenship. So she was kind of in this place where, she couldn't rock the boat. She couldn't kind of like say things. She had to keep her voice to herself. So that basically left me to be the only person to advocate for characters, subjects in the film, and frequently argue why things should be done a certain way or not done a certain way, or bring cultural nuances, and have a lot of difficult conversations when we're making the film.
Sorry. We had talked about at some point too, like at one point, when you have a director who maybe isn't from community and you're sort of fighting for certain things to be in the film. And I also would love to hear a little bit more, and if anyone else wants to talk about this too, like what's it like when you have a team in a space where you don't feel like, for instance, where you didn't feel like your assistant could speak up, but then also who's your audience ultimately for, who are you making this film for if you are not from community and you're not maybe necessarily always bringing in the perspective of your team who is from the community, and how does that shift not only who's the audience for, but sort of the story that you're putting onto screen for people?
That's a really interesting question. And audience is something that we grappled with throughout the process of making this film in ways that were not always very clear. So, for instance, the director's original intention that stated in raising funds and having a treatment was basically to go and make a film about a region that Americans didn't really know much about until 9/11 happened, and then they had to become aware of the Muslim world and learn about countries that they're pretty ignorant about. And I always make the joke that Americans learn about a place after it's been bombed or invaded. And so this is just like one of those examples. But in making the film, when we originally began to craft this narrative, we were pitched this project as being almost like a narrative-driven documentary. Like at times, the films Babel and Syriana were kind of big. And so the idea was like, how can we tell the story following 6 people and intercut their stories and do it in a way that's very verite-driven and essentially follow people and sort of learn. And so, for the first couple of years when Connor and I worked on it, that was really, because that's a vision we were on board with from the beginning, because it's a very artistic and creative way to make the film. So we were essentially kind of trying to figure out how to do that. Incredibly challenging with 800 hours, 5 or 6 languages, 6 people, a lot of material. And then, towards the end of in the second year, we had a rough cut. Then I think the director began to become hesitant about doing this more creative approach and sort of wanted to dial it back and put a voiceover into it that would sort of be more what I call explaining. And, you know, that's something I think both Connor and I resisted because A, it's not very creative, it's not artistic. And then, you know, then you're having to constantly explain and you are relying on this other element rather than getting the information from the material. And there are challenges with it. Certain things needed to be, certain information needed to be told to the audience. But, you know, there are ways to do that through title cards and whatnot. So that was one of the big challenges. And then at the end of our second year, the director basically fired both Connor and myself and then hired another editor to take our rough cut and cut it down to what you have. And then at the end of that, there was this voiceover that we had this debate over. And, you know, I think he tried to do it in a way that would integrate into the film because he had one of the 6 people actually do the voiceover rather than a disembodied narrator or a celebrity or, you know, something like that. But that was, you know, when I saw the final film, I was kind of jarred because this whole time we were trying to make the film in a certain way. And then it was a complete change. And I know that a lot of that came from test screenings where the audience was largely white or from a certain class, you know, Harvard friends or parents, friends of parents who maybe needed more context. But in the end, when I watched the film, to me, it really, even though it's a great film, it's solid, I'm really proud of it, it speaks well about Pakistan, it really humanizes people. For me, there's still an element of the white gaze. And that voiceover is speaking, you know, what Toni Morrison would say is speaking past me to the white person sitting behind me. And so even though, you know, I labored really hard to make this film, I was very passionate about it, gave much of myself, I'm in the end conflicted because I feel like there is a white gaze narration happening. And, you know, some people aren't bothered by it. I meet people from Pakistan who they're like so happy when they meet me and they're like, you made Without Shepherd, it's amazing, you worked on that film. So, you know, I think it's what are people used to seeing, what POV do they come from? But I can certainly say that other films at the time did what we were trying to do. There's a film called These Birds Walk, and that's done by Omar Malik, and I'm forgetting the co-director's name. But they made that film with just narration from people as sort of thoughts, and made a very accessible, beautiful, and artistic film that we were originally attempting to make a similar thing, but, you know, completely different subject. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
That was great. That was great. No, I really appreciate it. I mean, I feel like there's so much more to unpack there that we don't have, unfortunately, a lot of time to do, but maybe we can continue this conversation as we go forward, for sure. And we are keeping time to try and make sure we get into everyone's films here. So I'm going to keep on going, but if anybody wants to come back to any of that at some point, please feel free. Steph, we're going to go into your film here after Spring. And so let's show a clip, and then I feel like there's a lot of overlapping conversations that happen about this as well.
طالع من الخبز ذاك لوش كنت بالسوق ما فيش حد الفوضى الكبير حظك بشد الصخر شقك هي الطريق محمد مايا جاهزة تقريبا جوازها متوفرة الحمد لله يعني دقيقة ساعة شو طلع شو الأمة حقها مصاري مش بس قاعد تدرب وتفتش مش بس قاعد
بروسلي انت قلت لي غير احطه ايش ما كنت
هذا بروسلي شايف اللي بالنص اللي لابس بيجامة سود هذا بالكاراتيه مدرب
هسا مين بيفوز؟
بروسلي هسا شوف بشيل ايده ويجري هسا آخر شي بروسلي بيشيل له ايده ويجروا وهذا ما عاد يقدر يقوم ضربة قاضية
بكون أنا متضايق هون بالبيت. يوم إني بروح على مدرسة التايكوندو بنبسط كثير. يعني بسوريا ما كنا مش هيك تايكوندو للبنت، يعني كانوا يقولوا لي تايكوندو للبنت ما بعرف شو، بس كل البنات صار نيجي لهون على التايكوندو. أنا ورفقاتي، أنا شجعت رفقاتي ورفقاتي شجعني.
شريطة شوف صف هون
Thank you for that. I also want to point out that we do have ASL translators in English, and that you are, if you need captions, if you look in your chat, there should be a pinned chat for captions there as well. So many thanks to our ASL interpreters. Steph, we've talked a lot about this too, and I know there's some overlapping stuff that from what Faisal was talking about too, so I'm going to hand it over to you. But a couple of things that sort of came to mind for me in particular, and in some of the conversations that we were having too, were, you know, yes, you are not from community. You did this with another person who is also not from community, but lived in Syria, right? But you also have a background of coming, your family were refugees, and bringing, you know, you may not have been from the same place, but what are your experiences like? And one of the other things that I feel like we could touch on too, and we talked about, and Faisal, I'm curious how this sort of worked, and I don't know if there's time for this, but, you know, we talk about, yes, this is a film that is in an Arabic language. However, someone from Syria and someone from Egypt may have differences in language or colloquialisms that may not necessarily translate the same way, right? So how do you make sure that you're also doing this, you know, in a culturally appropriate way, and you're bringing on team members who are really able to really work with you on making the film as authentic as it possibly can, and being honorable and reflective of the people who are in the film. So Steph, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this film, you know, we really wanted to approach it from a place of, you know, authenticity and respect. And like you mentioned, myself and my directing partner are both not Syrian ourselves. Ellen Martinez is my co-director on this, and she actually grew up in Syria, so she has a background there. And then for me, it was kind of interesting. I actually wasn't really sure why I was so drawn into this project until we actually were in Jordan at this refugee camp filming. And as we were talking to these families and hearing their stories about where they came from, the things that they brought, you know, their experiences with government forces in their hometowns, I started feeling this familiarity, and I slowly realized, oh, well, this is because I've been hearing these stories my whole life from my grandmother's story. And, you know, even though her refugee story is entirely different, it happened, you know, a totally different generation, I think there was a lot of stuff that I related to, and I think really connected me to that space. So for us, you know, while we're not from the community, we didn't start from, you know, approaching it from a place of zero, but we wanted to make sure that we were upfront about that in the first place. You know, we know that, you know, if we were a pair of Syrians making this film, it would have been a different film. So with that, you know, we really wanted to make sure that we did collaborate with Syrians while making this film and other people of Arab descent. We relied heavily on our field producers when we were in Jordan, who are both Jordanian. And, you know, this is kind of a question that I know we've talked about this in our group before, and something that, you know, I think would be interesting to talk about is this idea of opening up the edit room to just beyond the editor. You know, our editor, Paul Lovelace, was amazing, and he approaches things from a place of empathy and receptiveness. But I think it is this receptiveness that was really important to us. Like, we really did want to listen to people from the community as we were making the film. So while we were making it, we had, I think it was like 25 different translators. And, you know, you're talking about different dialects, and we did make sure that they were all either Syrian or Jordanian, speaking that specific dialect of Arabic. You know, we had a couple Palestinians and that type of thing. So that was very important to us, both from a language perspective, but a cultural perspective. And one of kind of the like most, I don't know, fulfilling parts of the edit experience was when we would bring in the translators to the edit room, and we would like sit side by side cutting with Paul and our translators. And, you know, that's where we would be able to kind of break down some of the cultural nuances. And, you know, we'd straight up have translators say, you know, someone would never say this in this way, or, you know, this is this like very specific metaphor that they mean. And, you know, it really was a great learning experience for us. And I feel like if we didn't approach it with that openness, it would have been a much different film. And, you know, that kind of went on in the feedback screening process as well. We did really want to, we didn't want this to be an echo chamber. We didn't want to just screen it for our friends. You know, granted, you know, a lot of Ellen's friends from high school are Syrian, so we, of course, you know, screen it for them. But we also did something that I think, you know, a lot of doc filmmakers feel is somewhat controversial, but, you know, for us, it was really important, was that we screened it for the folks in the film, the families that we filmed with, you know, while we were cutting, because we really did want them to feel well represented and be able to like truly feel like what they were saying was what they meant. We didn't want to just send them, you know, the final cut and be like, oh, you know, this is the film. Can you sign off on it? That's it. You know, we really wanted the process to include them. So yeah, that was the process of After Spring, I guess.
I love that. I mean, one of the things that you brought up, and I think this was a conversation in particular that we had prior, and I'm curious if you all feel like we could talk about now, is how do, again, opening up the edit room, right? How do you have these conversations with your, not only your directors, but even your assistants, and who else is part of that conversation in the storytelling process? Does anybody else want to expand on that?
I mean, I'll speak to the Without Shepherd situation. It was very similar to what Steph is describing, except that we had 6 different languages: English, Urdu, and then, you know, a number of other languages. And so we began the film with logs of the languages that were translated in Pakistan, but they were done really quick and they weren't always accurate. So we had to bring in a number of translators here, which is kind of hard to find. Sometimes you look for a Dari translator, and it's incredibly hard to find because it's a very, you know, few people speak it, and it comes from Afghanistan. So we had certain challenges, but we were able to find translators, work through translations, and then as we were cutting scenes, we would bounce them off of people who speak the language. And luckily, most of it is in Urdu and not in the other languages. And I speak Urdu, so that was fine. But when we had other languages, we would kind of screen it for people who speak that language and say, you know, does this make sense, or is anything off? And then they would kind of help us refine the translations.
I was asked to not mute my mic early on, and here I was. Anyway, how do you all feel like that has influenced your ability to tell the story in a way that you felt like was really authentic to the people who were sharing their stories with us, right? So what do you think in terms of, and Randy, I think you talked about this too, like how do you include the people, this is conversations we had previous to this call here, but how do you include people in that participation so that you know that you're being truthful to the story, right? You're being honorable to the story.
Well, I have a ton of stuff to say on that after my clip, but I'll maybe just kind of sneak preview. Every film is really different in that equation, and who has the right to tell the story has always been a big question in Indian country, we would say. I mean, these are, everybody has a sense of ownership over stories and who has the right to tell them, and even down to the point where you know, certain names and words you're not supposed to say. So it's always been a really interesting maze to kind of navigate. And it's always a different equation. On the most recent film I worked on, it was a process of really listening and really kind of trying to find the heartbeat of this particular story. And that led us to kind of I'm going to speak at length about this later, but this process of really listening first to each other and then to the story really led us to sort of a pretty organic idea of what the heart of the matter was and whose voice was a vessel of truth in the story. And I'll elaborate on this a lot. I've got a lot of other thoughts, but I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Okay. Steph, is there any more specific things that you want to share in terms of like your collaboration before we move on?
I think we're pretty good. I mean, I think the only other thing that, you know, this was my first feature, as it was for my co-director. And I think for us, it really did kind of pave the way for how we approach storytelling now too. I mean, there's definitely a number of things that we probably wouldn't choose to make films about, and there's other people that should be making those films. But I think the thing that it really did taught me, and maybe spoiled me too in other edit rooms I found myself in, is having this open line of communication. You know, I work as an assistant editor and a junior editor and editor for other folks a lot too. And a lot of times I am the only person of color. And when it is an environment that is kind of allowing for a more supportive and honest communication, I think it only allows for a better film, and it does make it easier for you to raise issues. Whereas, like, if that line of communication isn't established, if you are any member of the crew, it does become a little bit more of a battle to kind of raise a concern, especially when it is a cultural, like, personal concern. So I feel like we're going to talk a lot about that after some of these other clips, but it was just kind of making me think about, that process and kind of all the types of storytelling that I try to do.
I really appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's keep moving forward, and then we'll come back to some of these juicier topics. Let's go to Far From the Tree.
I understand that you are interested in achieving a pregnancy.
Yeah.
Okay. First, I want you to tell me, how old are you?
34.
34. Do you smoke?
No.
Drink?
No.
And how many times have you been pregnant?
Once.
Okay. Tell me about that last pregnancy.
It was a year ago, almost exactly. We miscarried at 7 weeks.
Okay.
So
was there an ultrasound done?
They diagnosed the miscarriage with an ultrasound.
Okay. An ultrasound is routinely done between 11 and 14 weeks. That's where we offer every pregnant patient a risk assessment for genetic abnormalities.
You know, whether or not the baby will be born with a disability is, of course, it's something that we've thought about somewhat.
We can arrange for specific counseling for the genetic standpoint.
It's certainly something that the doctors talk about a lot, right?
IVF and PGD, those are certainly some options to test the embryo.
You know, I think they see normality as the end goal, and just sort of assuming that normality is what any parent would want for their child.
I really want a child. I would say that it's probably like the most basic evolutionary thing I've ever felt of, I just want a kid. I think every parent has a desire for their ideal child. You know, like some people, it's like, I really want a girl. But if they have a boy, it's not the end of the world. So I have a desire to have a little person. But if we had an average sized child, I think I will still get it on a level because I understand what it's like to be different than your family.
Welcome back. Thank you for that. So beautiful. Stephen, one of the things I love about this film is sort of navigating both perception and perspective. And you've talked about approaching this, you know, how do you approach this being outside of community, but bringing your own lived experience into this? So I would love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. So I would say one of the central themes of the film Far From the Tree is this question of how do we, within a family, sort of navigate differences between parents and children, or, you know, siblings, when sometimes our identities are vastly different, whether it be because of a disability, you know, a skill, like if you're, you know, a child prodigy or something, obviously you're very different from your parents. If you, you know, there are a lot of different things. Gender and sexuality are, of course, super relevant to that. And so, and then by extension, like, how does we as a society at large deal with people, you know, of differing identities and perspectives, and the ways in which over time, you know, certain things that have been considered illnesses or, you know, abnormalities or whatever become identities, or, you know, can become, like, you know, groups where people find agency and find comfort and community. You know, the film follows different sets of families. So, for example, the couple you just saw, Joe and Leah, are pregnant and expecting a child who will most likely be average size or typical size. So they're, you know, kind of grappling with what that means for them, you know, to sort of be able to identify with their child. And you know, I came to the project as initially an assistant editor. I knew I wanted to cut on the film, so I really made that known. And thankfully, my colleague Ben Gold, who's one of the editors, was very gracious and not territorial. And also, like Faisal mentioned, there was a lot of material to get through, so, you know, I lucked up in some ways. I, you know, did not grow up with a disability. I, you know, I felt like there, in my own family, generational differences, geographic ones, and things like that. But I wasn't, you know, directly from a community that was represented in the film necessarily. And at the time, I think I started work on this in 2016, even questions about that weren't necessarily on my mind. Like, I was just like, I'm trying to, you know, sort of work on interesting stuff. And, you know, questions of my right to tell this story were not something I was thinking about very much, and didn't seem to be as big of a topic of conversation in the community as they are now. But I realized, like, through the process of working on the film, that there were just certain experiences that allowed me to kind of channel a real sense of empathy and being able to sort of treat the scenes that I was working on with a sensitivity, and I learned a lot about, you know, issues of representation and things that I wouldn't have otherwise had to deal with, like, on a on a real day-to-day basis. Like every day I went into the cutting room and worked on this movie, I grappled with some issue of, you know, representing a community or what it meant to be different or other. And, you know, and frankly, growing up as a Black person in this country, the experience of being othered and, you know, and even in our industry within the documentary field, experiencing that, I felt like it gave me something to draw on, even though I wasn't, you know, necessarily like directly part of the identity group that was featured in the film. It would be hard to do that anyway, because there were a number of different, you know, stories and things like that, you know, to have everybody sort of equally represented in the film. But so it, you know, it was a real learning experience. And looking back on it, I think if I were approached with the project today, there were maybe be different questions I would ask, like, who do you have, you know, on the team who's, you know, who maybe is more directly from the community? Who do you, you know, what kind of outreach are you doing? What, you know, what is the sort of intended audience for the film? You know, even if it's a vague notion, like at the time, like what do you kind of imagine that to be? And so, you know, I think I'm proud of the work. It, I think, spoke to a lot of people. I mean, it's interesting because I think, you know, one of the contentious things about the film is like you have the viewpoint of parents, the parents of the family, and then you have the children. And, you know, sometimes, you know, historically, there's been a lot of trauma inflicted by parents who really wanted their kid to be a certain way, who really had this expectation of, you know, having a kid who was just like them. And so we see in the film some of the parents, you know, really struggling with that, and really having to come to terms with what their assumptions were. But you know, within I became aware that within certain communities, within the disability community and stuff, that, you know, this idea that parents get to speak, you know, sometimes for their children, or, you know, that was a really contentious issue because of the ways in which people often really suffered in terrible ways because they weren't their parents' ideal, you know, sort of model child. And so there's a real tension in terms of how the film was received, from people feeling like, you know, well, you're representing the view of the parents, you know, too much, maybe, like in this telling of this story. So, you know, that was something I really learned about through the course of working on the film. And it's a really difficult thing to, I think, not to sort of please everyone with the film. I think, like, by nature, you know, representing different viewpoints in a film, like there are going to be some who feel like their views were not represented properly, or maybe we could have taken a different angle. I think it's it has really been an experience I take with me, like with every future project, because I think it just gave me so much insight into what it means to, like, you know, have the power of representing different stories at your fingertips, you know, especially when you're not necessarily directly from a group. Now, I've worked on other stuff, you know, where the central theme were, you know, Black Americans or African American history and stuff. And my sort of place on the film was never questioned. You know, the right to work on it was never questioned. But I hope in my career, I'm not always necessarily put on something that seems to be an obvious fit because of my identity, you know. I'll stop babbling.
Not babbling at all. I love it. It's great. I mean, I think you brought up so many key things of, the duality of representation, right? And the many roles that we also play as storytellers. And one of the things that we talked about previously too was just empathy. And I feel like you really talked about that in a very personal way through the storytelling. So I'm going to keep going because I feel like we're going to deep dive into a few things. And I want to, and I feel like a lot of things that have been brought up is also the perspective of being an assistant and moving up, right? There's thematically, this is where we are. And Luna, I think we're going to cut to your piece here, and I would love to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So let's do What the Peer Gave Us, please. Thank you.
Yo soy una pluma sin rumbo. Es cuando se le chispa y se vuela. O sea, está sin rumbo porque no tiene dónde va a caer.
Hello, hello. So that was like just the smallest little taste of what is this really beautiful allegorical story about immigration and sort of searching for a place. I love the poetry and sort of how we're introduced to this. Luna, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about authenticity of storytelling. We've talked about voice and mentorship. And I'm going to leave it to you to chime in and where you feel most appropriate given your experience and the things that we've been talking about.
Sounds good. Can you guys hear me good? Yep. Okay, cool. I also realized I forgot to say that I'm like my room description, so I'm going to do it real quick. I'm in a white room. There's a plant behind me and a cart, and I'm a light-skinned brown cis woman. So with this piece, I started it off while I was in film school at NYU for their film program. I had gone to a panel at AFI Silver Docs, and I saw Sam Pollard at one of the editing panels. And so I decided to follow him because he's a genius. And when I got admitted into NYU, I came up to him and, I said, hey, I would love to learn from you. And with him, we did independent study for about 2 years. And the piece that I had worked on for that time was What the Peer Gave Us. And having worked with Sam Pollard, who is a genius, like brilliant Black editor, was really great for me because with this piece and throughout mentors for me, like Sam, but also Natalia Armada with her, I was also one of her associate artists in residence. These figures have been important in my life for me to help create the language of the work that I'm making. Not coming with like a privileged background and then diving into these worlds. Like I didn't know that I was making a poetic piece. I didn't know that I was making an observational piece. And so people were like, oh, this is what you're doing. So that was like really enriching. And especially when one of my first days in school, it was with another class, and there was this white boy that walked in, and the professor was like, this guy's the director. He's going to be the director. And I just remember like thinking, well, this is bullshit. Like, this is not right. And when I'm able to learn and be trained and nurtured by Black and Brown filmmakers, it creates a completely different experience because we get each other through different systems of oppression. And also through not just like the brutality of it, but also the beauty of it, like how we can kick it, how we can laugh, how we can get like certain jokes. And I really appreciate the mentorship that I have with Sam greatly. And he was also someone who believed deeply in mentorship. He was mentored by St. Clair born. And so a lot of the mentorship things that Sam had, he passed on to me. And these are also things that I carry with me. Like, I think by the time that I finished the independent study with him, like we met up for dinner, and like any other questions that I had, like I was able to ask him. And so he made himself very accessible and available for me to get to ask whatever it is that I had. But as a kind of transition from out of school, and I've had like great working environments too with Sam, but in my long like mentorship experience, I've also seen, and not just with Sam, but with other folks, I've seen kind of where there can be some holes or some gaps. And I think that with mentorship, it'd be great if it becomes something more involved in the sense of like a trained fellowship, or I don't know, like, you know, like maybe instead of hiring like a white editor for something, like hire that Black and Brown person who has a deep interest in editing and train them. And because this is like a way that we can decenter this white hegemony that we have in the film industry at the moment. So I am a huge proponent of like stories for us, by us, especially being in the Undocumented Filmmakers Collective and For Doc and Brown Girl Doc Mafia. An issue that a lot of like undocumented filmmakers have faced is that like as more discussions are occurring about diversity and Oscars So White, there are more people that are saying, okay, we need an undocumented impact producer, we need, you know, so forth and so forth. But and I've been hired too with like undocumented related films, but it's been most like in the beginning of my career, it was mostly for my social capital, like what was the access that I had to that film, to that issue, which was just like a hurtful experience because I'm also a filmmaker, like, and it just feels like you're being used and not like people really care for you. And while that experience like can help you somewhat monetarily, it didn't really help my career. So what I want to see more is like I think when one of the discussions that we were all having with Faisal, he mentioned that like, you know, if he can, he likes to ask a director for there to be an allotted time for mentorship. So if we can have more structures in place to be able to actually have disabled undocumented filmmakers in place to be able to transition, like I would love for that to happen, because these social capital experiences isn't really helping our filmmaker career. And I just really want to see a lot more stories like made by us. And it's not like, for me, I don't really see it as like a box in like, this is my identity and I'm only focusing on that. Because like, for example, with that film, like it's about the undocumented experience, but it's also poetry. So it's also about like the outlook that people are having. Like, it's not necessarily like a Black issue or a Black film. It's like so much more than that. You know, we're all like nerds or poets or like whatever it is. So that's just like a few of my thoughts on like mentorship and who has the right to tell the story.
I love that. I think that's really beautiful. We have a couple more minutes if anybody, I know this is a conversation that we have gotten deep into with the group. Does anybody want to say something before we move on? Because I feel like there's a lot of complimenting and supporting. Luna, I just want to echo that. I think that I love everything that you said and how important it is to hear, the importance of voice and authenticity and ownership of that story. And then also the importance of mentorship. I'm going to just real quick make a shout out to Disclosure, who has done a really good job of, okay, we haven't had a lot of trans people in these positions. How do we create opportunities for trans people to be in these positions? And I think all around, how do we constantly create opportunities versus trying to just figure out, like you said, Luna, what's your social capital? So I'd love to just get a little comment from anybody else.
I want to talk about mentorship. Since Luna, you brought up what we had in a previous conversation, mentorship is one of those things that's so hugely important and yet completely overlooked. And it's just, the opportunities for it in the independent film world where budgets are really limited are really difficult. And, you've got films made on shoestring budgets that people are trying to get through. And when you do have an assistant, the assistant is usually not with the editor. The assistant's usually just doing media management and preparing files and preparing sequences to cut, etc. And so I've just seen it's really hard for assistants to get the apprenticeship and actually learn how to edit from editors, which used to be really common in the older days, especially in the studio system. So one of the things, and I'm somebody that did not benefit from any mentorship. I didn't really have mentors. I had to kind of learn stuff on my own. And then it was really through a peer group that I was able to, essentially solicit answers to questions I had, or, I had to teach myself a lot as well. So I'm really conscious of trying to create mentorship opportunities for my assistants. And so one of the things I try to do when I come on board a project is really ask about, if we're going to have an assistant, do we have the budget so that we can work together for a certain period of time so the assistant can learn from you, because this is something important. And, as I bring it up, more directors and producers are actually very receptive to it. It's just something that slips their mind, but they also understand that it's really important. And so I've had a situation where this year I brought it up on a couple of films, and they made it possible for my assistant to work with me certain weeks. And, I gave her the opportunity to edit parts of the films. And then one film I left, and then she actually finished for me because I had another job. So it's really can work out in a very beneficial way. But I think that we as editors have to bring it up, and we have to put it top of mind, and we have to create and foster those opportunities.
Yeah, to add on to that too, because this is also just real quick, because this is an intersectionality panel. Quick shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined intersectionality, Black woman scholar. Being that we do have to take on more of these two mentor roles, it speaks to just how Black and brown people, we always do have to work a lot more, because we do want to make these changes of seeing, something that I do, because I haven't had the experience of directors being open to mentorship. I still took on an assistant editor who didn't have any assistant editing experience, but she's a Black woman, and I want to work with more Black and brown women with me. And I still took time out and trained her. And if we can have more directors who are open to putting that in the budget, it would help me out so much. And other folks too. So yeah, I'm really glad that you had brought up that as an example, Faisal.
I really had a similar experience in my filmmaking education where I didn't have a mentor. I just had a group of, peers and people who were all politically passionate and switched on in our early 20s in New York City. And we just kind of learned by doing it. And, my first short film was made with equipment that Todd Phillips rented from NYU and let me use over the weekend, And so I was always just kind of learning by screwing up, and over, that made my journey a lot more self-educatory, but also it took the absence of a mentor. There's a void there. It's different. So I've come to really, like Faisal was saying, appreciate mentors in my personal life, my professional life. As a martial artist, you quickly understand why there's that person. But I've gone on to teach on Indian reservations for many, many years, and become a mentor. But one of the things that I felt like was going on with me is because of I didn't have such a great relationship with my father, so I wasn't able to accept that. Like, I just was like anti-authority, like all the way when I started out. I didn't go to film school, I just kind of did it. And so there's also, I've run into that when I have taught. There's also just getting someone, sort of being trying to make someone feel okay to receive that takes time too. And that may or may not have anything to do with filmmaking. That's a whole other equation that I think we have to be aware of. Not everybody.
Indeed.
You can't show up and go, I'm going to be your mentor if someone doesn't want to hear it from anybody, So there's a lot of that to deal with too, which is part of the work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to establish that at the beginning, and it does help to alleviate this tokenism that has been happening. I mean, I do feel like a lot of times, and I think in my experience now, I'm kind of seeing red flags in terms of hiring practices. But if you see, hiring a person of a community just to kind of like fulfill a slot, that mentorship opportunity doesn't really exist, and you're not actually like listening to the person who is from that community. I think the most important thing is like looking at, this AE, this assistant editor, or whatever crew member as a creative partner in the process. And that also, I don't know, I just feel like having that open communication and that opportunity allows for, again, a better film. And it also helps with the whole like emotional burden aspect of it too. Like if you are the one token person of a community on a film, you are taking an extra kind of mental health burden as you're trying to tell a story as well. So I know, Luna, you had mentioned kind of this concept of being used, and I do feel like sometimes that does happen. I've definitely been hired to kind of like speak for, like Hong Kong people or whatever on a film. And, I'm not from there. My parents are from there, so I'm like related to it, but you also can't look at, hiring a person to kind of like check off the box and like, serve as the expert or whatever. It has to be this open line of communication throughout the whole process. So yeah, I do think having kind of that space to, allow for mentorship or debriefing or whatever you want to call it is super important, as we do this storytelling.
Yeah, and just to add one last thing to that, I think mentorship, apprenticeship, whatever we want to call that, I think is particularly important for people who are already, marginalized in the industry and in the world at large, because, I think it's important to feel like when you're working with people, to feel that, you have a real bond, you have some sort of camaraderie, like you have, there's an intimacy where you can share ideas and things like that. And it seems like often, at least in my experience, like, there seems to be like a drop off, like in terms of, who the editors are, who the directors are, et cetera. Like I've seen a lot of people in positions where they're assistant editors or, PAs or whatever on crews who are, where there's maybe a little more diversity in sort of the lower tier positions, but then, often it seems like those, people are not having the same opportunities, or if they're making, rookie mistakes or something like we all do, then those things there's like an extra, sort of burden placed on them, like they're not getting the passes that sometimes people are, getting, or you can't cozy up because you didn't go to Harvard or some, whatever it is. Like, and I've seen it a fair amount, I'm not being hyperbolic or anything. So I think it's extra important to foster that, the up and coming folks for, people who are just not well represented in the field, because it is something like something extra is needed. There's like an equity that is needed.
Yeah, and think about what sort of talent we'd be missing out on too if that environment isn't created there. If someone on their very first job, sees all these things that they are having difficulties bringing up and feel super uncomfortable, are they going to keep taking the jobs, or are they going to be like, oh, maybe editing is not for me, and then we've lost out on this voice.
Right.
So I think having that, having that like supportive environment is really important.
It is.
But again. So I was just going to say, there's the people who have found their way to sort of into the professional environment, and then there's people, like in my experience going to reservations, finding really talented people who aren't anywhere near ready for that step is what I'm talking about. That's another whole level of the work, because there's this whole thing about, Indian kids they might be shy, or there's a million reasons that they won't even make it to that place we're talking about. And I feel like that's a whole other kind of work that has to be done to build that confidence and have them, able to see themselves in these positions so that they can get the chance to be hired.
Right.
And there's a lot of, sometimes that's the journey,
And it may require too for folks who are understanding of those certain kids or whatever to be the one consistently to have to hire, so that when they're ready, they can't go into other realms or whatever. I just wanted to add to with the mentorship that maybe that isn't the right word too. Hearing Randy, your story of issue with authority too, I can relate it to that in a way. Formally being undocumented and just being this, fuck all these systems, it just doesn't make sense. So maybe mentorship isn't the right word because there is that hierarchy, but point being that there can be these sustainable practices where folks can have paid experience in a long-term way. And so even if that means for you as a mentor that you mentor someone for 1 year, 3 years from now, check in with them, hey, how are you doing? Do you need a job? Are you good? If you do have that access and power.
I love all of this. I want to jump in real quick, and then I want to get to Randy's clip so that we can round that out. And then if we want, we can pick back up with this conversation, or we can see where it takes us. And I know we have some questions coming in. Real quick, I just want to say consent. I hear consent as something that's really important, right? And how do we have that with everybody who's involved, right? I can say for me, having my assistant is having a partner, right? Someone who has the institutional knowledge of what is happening in the footage, who's hearing all the conversations that are happening, and has a point of view, their own bird's eye view, plus their own personal experience. So to miss out on an opportunity to include them in the creative process is missing out on, actually influencing and adding some creative input into the story. So for me, it's actually really crucial to have that as part of, that I think of it more of as a collaboration, right? And how do we keep influencing each other as we move on? I do want to make, let's real quick go to Randy's film. This is also a sneak peek for a film that's not out yet. This one's called Lies Closed This School.
The district is sucking out money. It's closing schools to try to make up that deficit. As it closes more schools, it loses more money.
As many as 24 underperforming Detroit public schools could be shut down.
32 other schools will be shut down this month.
Transformations on a scale that never existed before in any American district.
The plan to close 70 schools.
You have neighborhoods, there's no schools.
There's no elementary school, there's no middle school, there's no high school.
And so Detroit is really in free fall. Schools have always been used as an identifier. Detroit students and parents, they're born in this community, they grew up in this community, they're proud about the schools. Especially high school. People identified themselves by, I'm Cooley High. I'm Northern. I'm Mackenzie. I'm Kettering. People knew you. You know, Murray right over here.
Go Doughboys, that's all I can say.
Graduated 69 from Northeast. 1969.
1953. 1945.
Just a supporter of Miller High School and everybody that comes out.
All of the major schools in the city of Detroit that people identified themselves in the city of Detroit. You were whatever you were in the city of Detroit because of that high school. Those schools are all gone.
I just want to say, like, I'm loving, I got to see all these clips before, so getting to see them again, that gets me even more excited again. I didn't get a chance to beforehand give the caveat that, yes, this is, not only is this film not out yet, but it's still temp. So it's temp music, temp, there's no color correction done yet, temp mix. But Randy, I'm just going to hand it over to you because we've talked about a lot of things, and it sounds like you're just ready to sort of pick it up and go based on some of the things we've been talking about.
Well, I think that first, it's kind of personally really important for me, since we're talking about generative creative spaces, it's really important for me to say that this was one of the happiest, most fulfilling working experiences of my entire life, and I'm no spring chicken. So I absolutely adore the co-directors, Brian George and Samara Rosenbaum. Brian was also the other editor on the film, and Brent Palmer, the producer. And we were all from different backgrounds with different levels of education, different experience, different communication styles, overlapping at times, but different enough that it wasn't necessarily a match made in heaven on paper. And yet it was really heavenly as an experience. And so I've asked myself, why was that? And I really endeavored to try to come up with the one reason that would withstand the removal of all the other reasons. And what I was left with was listening. We all listened to each other at all times. There was never a bully in the room. There was never like somebody who was just waiting for you to stop so they could hear themselves talk more. I just never felt that at all. And I got to give the co-directors and the producer a lot of credit for creating a working environment and an editing room, and then later, because of the lovely pandemic, a remote editing situation where listening was a core value. And I think it led to, sometimes there were very forceful arguments made. There may have been a tear or two, but it was all in the spirit of hearing each other. And I think that we solved some of the film's bigger issues, structural issues of credibility in terms of characters, just by listening to each other. And so now back to your question. This is a movie about I'm not from Detroit. The producer was from Detroit. One of the directors had gone to school there, and the other director is from San Francisco. So some of us were from there, some of us weren't. But this is a movie about a group of tireless activists in Detroit fighting for quality education for their kids. The protagonist is an 82-year-old legendary activist named Mama Moore, who's been fighting for kids in Detroit since before most of us were born. So they're really the eyewitnesses of all of this. And we all know that there's a reason that criminals don't want to leave an eyewitness, is because they may tell the truth later, right? So we were looking at the film early on, and I don't mean this to sound wrong, but like sort of the documentary world at times is kind of chock full of academics who want to cut to experts as this idea of ultimate credibility. And, it's not that other voices aren't heard, but I see a lot of like rubber stamping, as the ultimate kind of authority. And I think to me, it is like a colonial gaze. I think, Faisal, you were talking about voiceover talking past you. I think an expert in a chair kind of unloading their IQ on you can feel the same way when you have a movie about people who literally have this story, like they're wearing it on their skin and in their eyes and in their hearts. And so early on, watching cuts, and again, they've been at this movie for a couple of years, making it, shooting it, assembling it before I parachuted in. So I had a kind of a bird's eye view of everything. And I realized I kind of was watching it thinking this was kind of going on. Like I was like, you've got this amazing group of people who are from there and have lived this experience and know it inside out. They've taken on politicians and corrupt officials and school board members and all manner of government officials, and they have figured out how to take on that system. They know how it works. So they're just as knowledgeable as these experts. And early on, I felt like that scale was kind of getting tipped into that maybe colonial gaze. And it seemed to even be more of a problem in a film about an African-American community if you cut to the white professor, that's kind of like all stood back. And via the listening I was talking about, we kind of came up with this idea that, we don't want to do that. So what did that look like in terms of practicality? How did we come up with a kind of a process to make sure that the people who lived it were as credible as anybody else? And we sort of looked at it and came up with a system, and sort of kind of like a 4-tiered system. And first, our lead characters, we all agreed that these are the activists telling the story. They're the living witnesses. Again, you never want to leave a living witness if you're a criminal, because they're going to tell you the truth. Secondly, if we cut to an expert, let's first make sure that our characters haven't made the same point already, and probably more charismatically and more organically. Thirdly, let's never cut to an expert just once, like no one-offs. Like I hate documentaries where they'll cut to like Professor Dumbledore at like the hour like mark in a movie for one thing. And so we just like decided we're just not going to do that. And fourthly, if that's a word, let's make the experts in the story characters that you come to care about. So in the clip you saw, that was Jamon Jordan, who's this like wildly charismatic, brilliant historian born and raised in Detroit, who not only knows the entire history of everything, but also went through the Detroit public school system and has lived this entire thing. So he's the main expert in the film, but he's also a main character in the movie, and who, again, he's lived the story as much as the activists have. And our other beloved experts, one of them I think popped on there. They're also from Detroit. One's a journalist, one's a lawyer, and another is a professor. But they're like a shitload of fun because like we braided them into the story in such a way that you feel that they have the same scars that the activists have. And so they were all wearing, again, this experience on their skin. So I feel after starting out just really listening to each other and then listening to the story, I felt like we were pretty successful in including the experts in the movie without that sense of intellectual segregation, without that sort of colonial hierarchy that I see in documentaries so much. And none of this would have been possible if we didn't listen to each other. And just to let you know what kind of the makeup of the group was, it's me, indigenous, Texan, cowboy, asthmatic, New Yorker, lives in LA, like I'm a million different things in my identity and a million different things in my professional career. We had white director, a Jewish co-director, and an African American producer, and there's people from Ivy League schools with PhDs, and people like me who I drove past NYU once on my bike. So we were all in there mixing it up, and none of that ever mattered. And I don't know the exact reason it all worked out, because I kept waiting for somebody's ego to show up. And it wasn't like our individual kind of attributes didn't raise their heads. We all processed information differently. We all saw things differently, but truly listening without an ego, it really just astonished me that it went on, and I was just like, any second somebody's ego is going to show up and fuck all this up, and it just never happened. And so that was as many different facets of who we were, where we were from, the way we did our editing, storytelling, showing up in this one sort of petri dish and just being wonderful. I wish I could have put it in a jar so I could unpack it every time. Because certainly we've all had the opposite experience. And sometimes, so basically that's my, love letter to this film. And it actually took me a little while to get over it. Like I moved on to other jobs, and it was kind of like getting over a, paramour or something else. It's like I literally, I hope they're watching because I know how much I love them. And I feel like this doesn't happen every time, and I feel like we're going to be friends. And so it was just like after as long as I've been at this, it was a really, really rewarding experience working on this movie. And it never came up. Like they were very sensitive to do they have the right to tell this story? They were very sensitive to including the group that it was about. And that as many screenings as we had with, really smart filmmakers or people they went to high school with, or, curated groups that saw the movie, the most important one to them was the Detroit. They were to say that we got to show this to the Detroit people. And that was literally like the ultimate test of have they done the job? Did we get at some kind of truth through this process? And overwhelmingly, they just absolutely loved it and responded to it. And we're all really excited to share it with the world. Of course, it was postponed by the lovely microbe that is our antagonist right now, but it's going to come out, and I think we're all going to be very, very proud of the film and of the spirit that it was made in as well.
They're playing the orchestra music on us, Randy, now, just so you know. they're telling us that we have to wrap this up. And I just want to let everybody know that I feel bad that you haven't had these conversations that I've been having with everyone on this panel for the past month, because I feel like we barely even scratched the surface of half the things that we've talked about. And there's so much more. We talked about that this panel should be 3 days long so that we can actually talk about all the things we want to talk about. But I have to close it out by saying thank you to everybody. I want to thank Hope and Andrea for your interpretations, your ASL interpretations. I want to thank the IDA. I want to thank my amazing panelists who have inspired me, taught me, and have done so much in creating this conversation. Luna, Faisal, Randall, Steph, Stephen. I want to thank the IDA, Maggie Bowman, Matt Ruiz, Tofano, Stephanie Owens, my co-collaborators who asked me to be the moderator and who really helped organize this: Sarah Garahan, Princess Hairston, Victoria Chalk, Medaya Maliani, Veronica Pigman, and Rahi Hassan, as well as my very supportive partner, Shalise Haas, my many mentors who have gotten me to this place, my assistants who have gotten me to this place. There have been some resources that should be coming up on your chat right now. We have many more. This is in partnership with the Alliance of Documentary Editors. I know there was some conversation around mentorship. There was another mentorship panel in a breakout room that the Alliance of Documentary Editors did. Please reach out to us. We want to continue having this conversation. I also want to point out to some aftercare support that is being done through Healing Justice. Thank you so much for offering that. There are resources through the IDA Getting Real website. please reach out to that if you feel like that is something that you need, want, desire, or even want to figure out how to continue doing forward. There will be, please stay involved. And I know that some other things came up in how to continue having conversations with us. Does anybody else, do we have time for everyone just to say one quick thing going out? Please go.
I just wanted to thank you for being such an awesome moderator, for really making this happen and do all the hard work with this channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much for all of your labor. Yeah, Julie really took the time to talk with us one-on-one, and then everything as a group. So everything was very thoughtfully planned out and cared for. So thank you so much.
I want to say, let's not lose touch with each other, and let's meet outside the matrix one of these days.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.